The smell of Margaret Chen's famous beef stew should have been comforting. But as Sarah sat at the familiar oak dining table, something felt wrong. Her mother had been unusually quiet all evening, fidgeting with her wedding ring, a nervous habit Sarah had learned to read like storm clouds on the horizon. "I have something important to discuss with you both," Margaret finally said, her voice carrying that formal tone she used for serious matters. David barely looked up from his phone, his designer suits somehow making him seem even more out of place in their modest family home. Sarah set down her spoon, her nurse's instincts already on high alert. At 28, she'd spent the last 5 years splitting her time between 12-hour shifts at the hospital and caring for her widowed mother. The cramped studio apartment she'd been renting felt more like a storage unit. Most of her real living happened here, in the house where she'd grown up, where her father's woodworking tools still hung in the garage and her mother's garden bloomed with the same roses Dad had planted 20 years ago. "It's about the house," Margaret continued, her hands now gripping the table's edge. "I've made a decision about what happens when I'm gone." David finally looked up, his attention caught. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "I'm leaving the house to David." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The entire house. Not half, not a share. Every. She watched David's face transform from mild interest to poorly concealed triumph, while her own world tilted sideways. "Mom, what do you mean?" Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. "David has a family to think about, Sarah. Emma's pregnant again, and they need the space. You're strong, you've always been strong. You'll figure something out." Strong. The word that had followed Sarah her entire life, used to justify every burden placed on her shoulders. Strong enough to handle Dad's death at 19. Strong enough to change career paths to stay close to home. Strong enough to work extra shifts to help with Mom's medical bills while David built his real estate empire an hour away. "But Mom, we talked about this. You said the house would be split fairly between us." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "I've been taking care of everything here. The new roof last year, the furnace repair, groceries, your medications, and I appreciate that, sweetheart. But David has more responsibilities now." Sarah looked at her brother, waiting for him to say something, to acknowledge the unfairness, to suggest they share it as planned. Instead, David reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "Thanks, Mom. This means everything to Emma and me. And don't worry, Sarah. You know you're always welcome here." Welcome, in her own childhood home. As a guest, the beef stew had gone cold, but Sarah couldn't taste anything anyway. Around her, the house seemed to whisper all the promises it would never keep. The workshop where she'd planned to restore Dad's projects, the garden where she'd imagined her own children playing someday, the kitchen where she'd cooked countless meals while David lived his separate life in the suburbs. Margaret was already talking about practical matters, about lawyers and paperwork, but Sarah heard it all through a fog of betrayal. 5 years of sacrifice, of putting her life on hold, of being the responsible one, and this was her reward. She was strong enough to handle it, after all. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. She sat in her cramped studio apartment, staring at the stack of receipts on her desk. 5 years of home repairs, medical copays, and grocery bills that told a story her mother had apparently forgotten. The numbers blurred together: $3,200 for the roof, $1,800 for the furnace, countless smaller amounts for prescriptions, food, utilities she'd helped cover when Margaret's fixed income fell short. The next morning she found herself back at the house, ostensibly to check on her mother but really to search for answers. Margaret was at her book club and Sarah had kept her key for emergencies, her mother had said. Now she wondered if she'd need to give that back too. In Margaret's bedroom, Sarah found what she was looking for. The old metal box where her father had kept important documents. Her hands trembled as she opened it, finding copies of wills dating back 15 years. The earliest version, written just after Dad's death, split everything equally between Sarah and David. But there were others, revised versions from 3 years ago, 2 years ago, last year. Each one gave David more and Sarah less, until the final version left her with nothing. "What are you doing here?" Sarah spun around to find Mrs. Johnson, their elderly neighbor, standing in the doorway. The woman had been like a grandmother to Sarah, and her expression was pained. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. Margaret gave me a key to check on things while she's out." Mrs. Johnson stepped closer, her voice dropping. "I heard about the house, dear. I'm so sorry." "Did you know?" Sarah asked, the words tumbling out. Did you know she was planning this? Mrs. Johnson's silence was answer enough. Then, quietly, David's been visiting more often than you know. When you're at work, he's been talking to your mother about his financial troubles, about how hard it is to provide for his family. Financial troubles, Sarah's voice cracked. He drives a BMW and lives in a $500,000 house. He told your mother he was struggling, that he'd made some bad investments, that he needed help but was too proud to ask. Mrs. Johnson shook her head sadly. He also said you were too busy with your career to want the house, that you'd told him you were planning to move away anyway. The lies hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd never said any such thing. In fact, she'd turned down a lucrative job offer in Seattle specifically to stay close to her mother. David knew that she'd told him about it last Christmas. There's something else, Mrs. Johnson whispered, glancing around nervous. I've seen him going through your mother's mail, and last month I saw him leaving the bank with her. She looked confused, but he seemed to be handling everything. Sarah's medical training kicked in, organizing the symptoms, the pattern of revised wills, the lies about her intentions, the bank visits, her mother's recent forgetfulness. This wasn't just favoritism, it was manipulation, possibly worse. Mrs. Johnson, has Mom seemed different lately? More confused, more forgetful. The older woman nodded slowly. She has been having some memory issues. Nothing major, but David always seems to be there when she's having her worst days. He's very helpful. The word tasted bitter in Sarah's mouth. She thought of all the times David had called her dramatic, oversensitive, jealous. How he'd positioned himself as the reasonable one, the successful one, the one who deserved more because he'd achieved more. But now she could see the truth. David hadn't been the golden child by accident. He'd been actively cultivating that role, feeding their mother's fears about Sarah's independence, while painting himself as the dependable son who needed support. The betrayal was deeper than she'd imagined. It wasn't just about the house, it was about years of systematic manipulation, of lies designed to make her mother doubt Sarah's love while inflating David's needs. As she drove home that afternoon, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. The hurt was still there, raw and deep, but underneath it, something harder was forming. She'd been called strong her whole life. Time to find out what that really meant. Sarah's nursing background had taught her the value of thorough assessment before treatment. Over the next 2 weeks, she approached her family situation like a complex medical case, gathering data while maintaining a carefully neutral facade. The first breakthrough came when she requested copies of her mother's bank statements, claiming she wanted to help organize Margaret's finances. What she found made her stomach turn. Regular withdrawals of $2,000, $3,000 over the past 18 months, always on days when David had visited. When she cross-referenced with her own records, a pattern emerged. David came by on Margaret's bad days when her arthritis flared up or she was feeling particularly anxious about money. I need to help Mom with some financial planning, Sarah told David during their next phone call, keeping her voice casual. Can you walk me through those loans you mentioned? The ones that have been so stressful. The silence stretched too long. What loans? The ones Mom told me about. Your investment troubles? She's been really worried about helping you out. Sarah, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't asked Mom for money. She almost admired how smoothly he lied, but his denial was exactly what she'd hoped for. Sarah had started recording their conversations after the third suspicious bank withdrawal. Washington was a one-party consent state, and everything was perfectly legal. Her next move was strategic. She called David's wife Emma, using her pregnancy as a natural conversation starter. 20 minutes of chat about morning sickness and nursery themes, and Sarah had what she needed. David's business was thriving. His latest development project had just secured a major investor. He'd bought Emma a new Lexus for her birthday. David's been such a rock through everything, Emma gushed. I don't know how he manages it all. The business stress, helping your mom, making sure we're taken care of. He never complains, but I know the financial pressure has been intense. Financial pressure? Sarah kept her voice carefully curious. Oh, with his investments not performing like he hoped. But he's too proud to let it show. He always says family takes care of family, even when it's hard. More lies, but Emma clearly believed them. David had been playing both sides, painting himself as the struggling son to Margaret while maintaining his successful image with his wife. Sarah's breakthrough came during her next visit to Margaret. She arrived early before her mother expected her and found David in the kitchen with financial documents spread across the table. "What's all this?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the official-looking papers. David quickly shuffled them together. "Just helping Mom organize some things. You know how she gets confused about financial stuff," but Sarah had seen enough. Power of attorney documents, investment account transfers, and what looked like a reverse mortgage application. Her mother was in the living room, napping in her chair, unaware that her son was systematically accessing her assets. That evening, Sarah made 2 phone calls. The first was to her friend Jessica, who worked in elder law. The second was to Adult Protective Service. "What you're describing could constitute financial elder abuse," Jessica told her, "especially if there's evidence of exploitation during periods of confusion or vulnerability. Do you have documentation?" Sarah looked at the folders she'd been building, bank records, recordings, photographs of the documents she'd seen. "Yes. The tricky part is that your mother may not see herself as a victim. Many elderly people are reluctant to admit their adult children are taking advantage of them. What would you recommend? Build your case quietly, document everything. And Sarah, be prepared for this to get ugly. Family financial abuse cases usually tear families apart." Sarah almost laughed. Her family had been torn apart the moment David decided to systematically manipulate their mother against her. The next phase of her plan was the hardest, pulling back. She stopped contributing to Margaret's expenses, stopped doing the routine maintenance on the house, stopped being available for every small crisis. When Margaret called about a leaky faucet, Sarah suggested she call David. After all, he'd be inheriting the house and should handle these things. "But you're so much better at this stuff," Margaret protested. "David's the one with the real estate background, Mom. He'll know what to do." She watched from a distance as small problems began accumulating. The gutters needed cleaning, the furnace made strange noises, the garden went untended. Margaret called David increasingly often, and Sarah could see the strain starting to show in her brother's carefully maintained facade. The coup de grace came when Sarah discovered David had been lying about something else: the house itself. Her father had been meticulous about maintenance, but he'd died before addressing some major issues. Sarah had been quietly handling them over the years, but her research revealed problems David couldn't possibly know about: foundation settling that would need attention within 5 years, an electrical panel that didn't meet current codes, and aging plumbing that would require significant updates. David thought he was inheriting in reality he was about to own a money pit that would require at least $200,000 in immediate repairs. Money she was certain he didn't have, based on the financial records she'd been gathering. Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. Sometimes the best revenge was simply stepping back and letting people face the consequences of their own choices. All she had to do now was wait. The first cracks appeared 3 weeks later. Margaret called Sarah at work, her voice shaky with frustration. "The kitchen sink is backing up again and there's a stain on the ceiling in the guest room. I called David but he says he's too busy with a big project. Can you come over?" "I'm sorry, Mom, but I'm pulling a double shift tonight. Maybe try a plumber." David should be able to recommend someone, since he'll be taking care of these things now. Sarah heard the hurt in her mother's silence. Margaret had grown accustomed to Sarah dropping everything for house emergencies, but those days were over. If David wanted the house, he could handle its problems. By the following week, the calls were coming daily. The furnace was making rattling sounds. The gutters were overflowing. The garage door opener had stopped working. Each time Sarah politely redirected Margaret to David, reminding her that he was the practical choice for handling property issues. David's frustration was evident when he finally called Sarah directly. "What's going on with you? Mom says you won't help with anything anymore." "I'm just letting you handle things, since you'll be the homeowner. Makes sense, right?" "Sarah, come on. You know I'm swamped with work. Can't you just—" "Actually, David, I've been meaning to ask you something." Sarah kept her voice conversational. "Mom mentioned you've been struggling financially. I was thinking maybe I could help out with some of the house expenses, until you get back on your feet." The trap was perfect. If David admitted to financial struggles, he'd have to explain why he needed the house. If he denied them, he'd have to explain why he couldn't handle the maintenance costs. "I never said I was struggling financially." "Oh, that's strange. Mom said you'd been asking for help with some investments that went bad." She seemed really worried about it. Another long pause. "Mom gets confused sometimes. You know how she is. Sarah felt a cold satisfaction. He was digging his own grave. So you can handle all the house expenses then? That's great. There's actually quite a lot coming up. The roof needs some work, and I think the foundation might need attention. What do you mean the foundation? Oh, just some settling Dad noticed before he died. He was going to address it, but well, you know, I've been keeping an eye on it, but since you're taking over, she let the sentence hang. David's voice sharpened. What kind of foundation problem? I'm sure it's nothing you can't handle. You're the real estate expert after all. After they hung up, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. David was starting to realize that inheriting the house might not be the windfall he'd imagined. The pressure continued building. Margaret called Sarah crying because the basement had flooded during a heavy rain. An old problem Sarah had been managing with strategic sandbags and a sump pump that needed regular maintenance. David had to leave his important business meeting to deal with it, and Sarah heard through Miss Johnson that he'd spent most of the day swearing at the water damage. Then came the phone call Sarah had been expecting. I think we need to talk about splitting some of these house costs, David said without preamble. It's not fair for me to handle everything when you've been living there basically rent-free for years. Living there rent-free. Sarah's voice was dangerously quiet. David, I haven't lived there since I moved out at 22. I have my own apartment, but you're there all the time using the utilities, eating the food, taking care of our mother, you mean, which I notice you haven't been doing much of lately, even though she's been calling you daily about house problems. Look, I'm just saying maybe we should both contribute until the transfer is final. It's only fair. Fair, the word he'd never used when Sarah was shouldering all the responsibility alone. Actually, David, I've been thinking, maybe Mom should reconsider this whole arrangement. The house is becoming a real financial burden, and with your business doing so well, maybe you don't need it after all. What do you mean my business doing so well? Another trap. Sarah had been talking to Emma regularly, gathering intelligence about David's actual financial situation. Emma mentioned the new investor, the successful project launches. It sounds like you're doing really well for yourself. The silence stretched longer this time. Sarah could practically hear David's mind racing, trying to figure out how much Emma had told her and how much of his story was unraveling. Things are complicated right now. Complicated how? But David had already hung up. That weekend, Margaret called Sarah with news that made her stomach drop. David's moving in temporarily. He says it makes sense for him to be here while we handle the property transfer, and Emma needs some space to prepare for the baby. Sarah knew better. David was moving in to control the situation, to manage Margaret's access to information and limit Sarah's influence. The stakes were rising, and her brother was consolidating his position, but Sarah had been planning for this too. The next phase of her strategy was about to begin, and David had just walked right into it. The family meeting was Margaret's idea, though Sarah suspected David had prompted it. We need to clear the air, Margaret had said over the phone. There's too much tension in this family, and I won't have it. Sunday dinner, both of you, no excuses. Sarah arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, carrying a manila folder in her purse. David's BMW sat in the driveway next to a beat-up Honda she didn't recognize. Through the window she could see her brother pacing in the living room, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing frantically. Margaret opened the door before Sarah could knock. Her mother looked older, more fragile than she had just weeks ago. The stress was taking its toll. Sarah, honey, I'm so glad you're here. David's been... Margaret's voice trailed off as she glanced toward the living room. He's been having a difficult time. Mom, we need to talk, Sarah said gently. But before she could continue, David appeared in the hallway. Finally, he said, ending his call with obvious frustration. We need to figure this out, Sarah. The house situation is getting complicated. They gathered around the same oak table where this nightmare had begun. Margaret had made her beef stew again, but none of them were eating. David looked haggard, his usual polished appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and dark circles under his eyes. I've been thinking about what's best for Mom, David began, his tone carefully reasonable. Maybe we should consider selling the house instead of transferring it. Split the proceeds, use Mom's share for better care. Sarah almost laughed. Better care? You mean like the care I've been providing for 5 years while you visited twice a month? That's not fair, Sarah. I've been contributing. Contributing what, exactly? Sarah opened her folder and pulled out the bank statement. These show regular withdrawals totaling almost $50,000 over the past 18 months. Want to explain where that money went? Margaret's face went pale. $50,000. David, what is she talking about? David's composure cracked. Mom, you know I was helping you with investment. We talked about this. What investments? Margaret's voice was sharp with confusion. David, I never asked you to invest my money. You were worried about your finances. I was trying to help. Sarah pulled out her phone and played the recording from their conversation weeks earlier. David's voice filled the room. I haven't asked Mom for money. I don't know what you're talking about. The silence was deafening. Margaret stared at David with growing horror, while he looked between Sarah and their mother like a trapped animal. You recorded? David's voice was barely controlled fury. I documented everything. Sarah's voice was steady. The lies you told Emma about your financial struggles. The lies you told Mom about my career plans. The power of attorney documents I saw you preparing without Mom's full understanding. Before David could respond, the doorbell rang. Margaret looked confused, but Sarah stood up. I'll get it. She opened the door to find two people on the porch. Jessica from the elder law firm, and a woman Sarah didn't recognize wearing a badge. Sarah, I'm Detective Martinez, Adult Protective Services. We spoke on the phone. You called APS? David's voice behind her was strangled. Sarah, what the hell? I reported suspected elder financial abuse, Sarah said calmly, turning back to face him. Which is exactly what this is. Margaret was struggling to understand. Elder abuse? Sarah, what are you saying? I'm saying David has been systematically stealing from you, Mom. Manipulating you when you're confused or worried, lying about his financial situation, and turning you against me so I wouldn't interfere. That's not. I would never. David started towards Sarah, but Detective Martinez stepped between them. Sir, I need you to calm down. The doorbell rang again. This time it was a man in a cheap suit carrying a clipboard, looking harried and frustrated. David, I'm looking for David Chen. Who are you? Margaret asked. Debt collector. Mr. Chen has been avoiding our calls about his outstanding business loans. We've traced him to this address. The color drained from David's face. This is harassment. You can't. Actually, we can. You listed this property as collateral on your loan applications. We need to discuss your payment plan. Sarah watched as David's carefully constructed world imploded in real time. The debt collector was explaining something about failed investments and overextended credit lines, while Detective Martinez was asking Margaret about her recent financial transactions, and Jessica was setting up her laptop to document everything officially. David, Margaret's voice was small and broken. Is this true? Are you in debt? Did you take my money? David looked around the room, at the detective, the debt collector, the lawyer, his mother's devastated face, and finally at Sarah. For a moment she thought he might continue lying, might try to charm his way out of this, like he always had. Instead he crumpled. I was going to pay it back, he whispered. The investments were supposed to work. I just needed some time. Margaret made a sound like a wounded animal. The truth was finally out, but Sarah found no satisfaction in her mother's pain. Mrs. Chen, Detective Martinez said gently, we need to discuss placing a hold on any property transfers until we can sort this out. Your son may be facing criminal charges. As if on cue, Margaret clutched her chest, her face going gray. I can't breathe. I can't. Sarah was beside her mother in an instant, her nursing training taking over. Mom, look at me. Breathe slowly. In through your nose, out through your mouth. But Margaret's distress was too severe. Call 911, Sarah ordered, already checking her mother's pulse. Now, the beef stew went cold on the table, while paramedics worked on Margaret in the living room. David stood frozen in the hallway, finally understanding that his actions had consequences he couldn't charm his way out of. The golden child had finally fallen, but the cost was higher than Sarah had ever imagined. Margaret survived the heart attack but barely. As Sarah sat beside her mother's hospital bed, 3 days later, watching the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, she wondered if winning had been worth it. The doctors say it was brought on by stress, Margaret whispered, her voice still weak. I keep thinking about all those times David needed money, and I wanted to help him. I know, Mom, but you were the one who was really helping me, weren't you? All those years, and I couldn't see it. Sarah squeezed her mother's hand gently. You loved us both. David just took advantage of that love. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. David was charged with elder financial abuse and fraud, his assets frozen pending investigation. The house sale was halted, leaving it in legal limbo while attorneys sorted through the mess. Emma had filed for divorce after discovering the extent of David's deceptions, taking their children and moving back to her parents' house. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. David had destroyed everything trying to secure his future, and now he had nothing. But the biggest surprise came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Margaret was released from the hospital. Sarah was helping her mother sort through medical bills when her phone rang. Sarah, this is Dr. Patricia Hoffman from Seattle General. I know it's been several months since we last spoke, but I wanted to follow up on our job offer. Sarah had almost forgotten about the position she'd turned down to stay close to her mother. Dr. Hoffman, I appreciate you calling, but my situation hasn't changed. Actually, that's why I'm calling. We've had some developments here. Are you familiar with Marcus Webb? The name meant nothing to Sarah, but she listened as Dr. Hoffman explained. Marcus Webb was a philanthropist who served on Seattle General's board of directors. His foundation funded a new program for nurses who had demonstrated exceptional dedication to family caregiving. He read about your situation. The nomination you received for the Compassionate Care Award last year mentioned your commitment to your mother. He'd like to offer you something unique, a position here with housing assistance and a care coordinator for your mother, if she's willing to relocate. Sarah's hand trembled as she held the phone. I'm sorry, what? It's a full package, Sarah. The salary we discussed, plus a signing bonus, plus comprehensive support for your mother's care. Ms. Webb believes that people who sacrifice for family shouldn't have to choose between career advancement and doing the right thing. After the call ended, Sarah sat in stunned silence. The job she'd given up, the opportunity she'd sacrificed for family duty, had somehow found its way back to her better than before. What was that about? Margaret asked from her chair. Sarah explained the offer, watching her mother's face carefully. She wouldn't pressure her, wouldn't make Margaret feel guilty for whatever choice she wanted to make. Seattle, Margaret said thoughtfully. Your father always wanted to visit the Pacific Northwest. Mom, you don't have to, honey. I've spent too many years making decisions based on fear and guilt. Maybe it's time I made one based on what's actually best for both of us. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the driveway of her childhood home for the last time. The house had finally sold at a loss, due to the structural problems David hadn't known about, and the proceeds would pay for Margaret's assisted living facility in Seattle. It was beautiful with gardens and activities, and Margaret had already made friends with her neighbor, Miss M, who shared her love of mystery novels. David was serving 18 months in minimum security prison. He'd lost his business, his house, his family, and his reputation. Emma had been granted full custody of the children, and they rarely mentioned their father. The golden child had become a cautionary tale, but as Sarah loaded the last boxes into her car, she felt no satisfaction in David's downfall. Karma, she'd learned, wasn't about revenge, it was about consequences. David had created his own destruction through years of lies and manipulation. All Sarah had done was stop enabling him. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Webb, whom she'd met the week before. Hope the move goes smoothly. Looking forward to having you on the team. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. Sarah smiled. She'd thought the scraps her mother had given her, the expectation that she'd be strong, independent, capable of figuring things out, had been a punishment. Instead, they'd been exactly what she needed to build a life she was proud of. Margaret was waiting in the car, her purse clutched in her lap like she was going on an adventure. Ready, sweetheart. Ready, Mom. As they drove away, Sarah caught a glimpse of Mrs. Johnson waving from her porch. The elderly woman had become Margaret's confessor over the past months, listening as her mother worked through years of guilt about the favoritism that had nearly destroyed both her children. I keep thinking about what your father would say about all this, Margaret said as they reached the highway. What do you think he'd say? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. That the strongest people aren't the ones who never fall down, they're the ones who help others get back up. Sarah reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. It had taken a family crisis, a heart attack, and the destruction of everything they'd thought they knew about themselves, but they'd finally found their way to each other. The house in the rearview mirror grew smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking its ghosts and broken promises with it. Ahead of them lay Seattle, new beginnings and the radical idea that love didn't have to hurt to be real. Sometimes the best revenge was simply living well and helping the people you loved do the same.